They all laughed at my niece's graduation party while I sat alone in the corner, my stage 3 diagnosis burning a hole in my pocket. What they didn't know was that by the time my treatment ended, my $7 million estate would be going to people who actually showed up for my chemotherapy appointments. Let me tell you how I rewrote my legacy while fighting for my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Rosewood Community Center looked particularly cheerful. That afternoon, decorated with bright blue and silver streamers for my niece Amber's high school graduation. The room buzzed with the voices of my siblings, their children, cousins, and family friends, all celebrating another milestone I'd helped fund but felt increasingly distant from. I'd organized a generous gift for Amber, a fully paid college fund that would cover her dream school. The card with the details sat unopened on the gift table. What no one at that party knew was that 3 days earlier, Dr. Harrison had sat across from me in her office, hands folded carefully on her desk, as she explained that the routine tests I'd undergone the previous week had revealed stage 3 ovarian cancer. The treatment plan would be aggressive, surgery followed by multiple rounds of chemotherapy. "Do you have someone who can drive you to appointments?" she'd asked. "Family nearby to help during recovery?" I'd nodded automatically, thinking of my 3 siblings who lived within a 20-minute drive, my 5 nieces and nephews who often asked for favors, and the dozens of relatives who never hesitated to call when they needed financial advice or, more often, financial assistance. The same relatives who now filled this community center, enjoying the catering I'd arranged, completely unaware that beneath my carefully applied makeup and silk blouse, I was carrying a diagnosis that had rewritten my entire future. "Jennifer, come join us for the toast." My brother Michael's voice boomed across the room. He stood with our sister Sarah and brother David, champagne glasses raised as they prepared to celebrate Amber's accomplishments. I forced a smile and approached, ignoring the dizziness that had become my constant companion over the past few months. A symptom I'd dismissed as stress from managing the family's financial consulting firm. "To Amber," Michael announced, "for making us all proud, and for her bright future at Stanford." The crowd cheered, and glasses clinked. I sipped my water, the doctor's instructions to avoid alcohol still fresh in my mind. "Aunt Jen, aren't you having champagne?" Amber asked, her forehead creasing with mild concern, the first anyone had shown me all evening. "Just pacing myself, sweetheart." "Big meeting tomorrow," I lied smoothly. At 52, I'd perfected the art of putting others at ease, of making my own discomfort invisible. Sarah leaned in, her expensive perfume almost overwhelming. "Speaking of meetings, David and I were hoping to talk to you about increasing the quarterly distributions from Dad's trust. College expenses are really adding up, and with David's renovation project." Of course, no conversation with my siblings was complete without a request for money. As the executor of our parents' estate and the only financially responsible sibling, I'd spent the past 12 years managing the family's considerable assets, including the successful financial consulting firm our father had built. My siblings had received generous distributions, but always seemed to need more, their lifestyles consistently exceeding even the substantial allowances from the trust. "We can discuss it next week," I replied, suddenly exhausted. "I'm not making any financial decisions tonight." What I didn't say was that I'd spent the morning meeting with my own financial advisors, reorganizing my affairs in preparation for what might come. David frowned, his hand tightening around his champagne flute. "It's not really a big deal, Jen. Just a small adjustment to the distribution schedule." "Next week," I repeated firmly, watching as my siblings exchanged glances. They weren't used to me refusing their requests, especially not at family gatherings where keeping the peace had always been my responsibility. As the evening progressed, I sat at a corner table, observing my family. Michael's wife, Rebecca, was showing off her latest designer handbag to Sarah. My nephew Tyler was bragging about the European trip I'd partially funded as his graduation present last year. My younger nieces were scrolling through their phones, occasionally taking selfies with the elaborate dessert table I'd arranged. Not one of them, not a single family member, had asked how I was doing. No one had noticed my weight loss or the fatigue that made even standing an exercise an endurance. The diagnosis card from the hospital felt heavy in my purse, its contents a secret that shouldn't have had to be a secret at all. I thought about all the times I'd shown up for them. The middle-of-the-night phone calls when Sarah's son had been arrested for underage drinking, the emergency loan when Michael's business venture had failed, the countless school events, birthdays, and anniversaries I'd organized and funded. I'd never married or had children of my own, pouring my energy instead into being the perfect aunt, the reliable sister, the family backbone. Now, facing the biggest challenge of my life, I realized with startling clarity that the support I'd given so freely was not going to be reciprocated. The revelation settled in my chest, heavier than the cancer that had taken root there. My phone buzzed with a text message, not from family, but from Elena, my assistant at the firm who had become more of a friend over the past decade. "How are you holding up?" The message read, "Do you need me to come get you?" Elena was the only person I'd told about the diagnosis, almost by accident. She'd been in my office when Dr. Harrison called with the preliminary results, and the shock had made it impossible to maintain my usual composure. Since then, she'd been researching treatment options, offering to drive me to appointments, and checking in regularly. More support than my own blood had provided. "I'll be leaving soon," I texted back. "Meeting with the lawyer still on for tomorrow?" "Confirmed for 10 a.m., Elena replied. "I've pulled all the documents you requested." As I put my phone away, I caught my reflection in the darkened window of the community center. I barely recognized myself, not because of the cancer, which had yet to leave its visible marks, but because of the decision forming behind my eyes. For the first time in my adult life, I was considering putting myself first, and the thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, I sat across from Thomas Whitfield, the estate attorney who had handled my parents' affairs and now managed mine. His office on the 32nd floor of Portland's most prestigious address offered sweeping views of the city and the distant mountains, a view I'd always found calming. Today, it barely registered as I slid Dr. Harrison's report across his polished desk. "Stage 3, I said simply. "The prognosis is hopeful with aggressive treatment, but nothing is guaranteed." Thomas removed his glasses, genuine concern in his eyes. One of the few people who had known me for decades, he'd watched me navigate the sometimes turbulent waters of family wealth management. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," I said, straightening in my chair. "I want to completely restructure my will and the family trust provisions." For the next 2 hours, we discussed the intricate details of my estate. My personal assets were substantial. The family firm had thrived under my leadership, and my own investments had performed exceptionally well. Beyond that, I controlled significant portions of the family trust as its executor. "Your siblings aren't going to be happy with these changes," Thomas warned as he reviewed my proposed modifications. "They're not happy anyway," I replied, a new edge to my voice. "And they won't know about any changes until it's relevant." By the time I left Thomas's office, the framework was in place. My personal estate, valued at approximately $7 million, not including the business, would no longer be distributed equally among my siblings and their children. Instead, the bulk would go to a foundation supporting cancer research and patient advocacy, with specific provisions for Elena and a few loyal employees who had become more like family than my actual relatives. The control of the family business would transfer not to Michael, who had always assumed he would inherit our father's position, despite showing little interest in actually learning the industry, but to a carefully selected board of directors with Elena as the chief operating officer. My siblings would receive modest stipends, but nothing close to the windfall they had been expecting. As I stepped out of the building into the warm June sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in months, despite the weight of my diagnosis. The decision hadn't been made out of spite, though I couldn't deny the element of justified retribution. It had been made out of clarity, the sudden, stark understanding that my life's purpose was not simply to fund my family's comfortable existence. The first chemotherapy session was scheduled for the following Monday. I'd cleared my calendar under the guise of a business trip, not yet ready to share my condition with the wider family. Elena had arranged to drive me and stay throughout the treatment, which was expected to last several hours. Sunday night, I received a call from Sarah. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Jen, we need to talk about Tyler's tuition payment for the fall semester," she said without preamble, not even a hello. "The bursar's office is saying they haven't received it, and registration closes next week." I closed my eyes, sitting on the edge of my bed where I'd been reviewing the information packets from Dr. Harrison about what to expect during treatment. "I sent the check 2 weeks ago," I said, though in truth, with everything happening, I couldn't clearly remember if I had. "Well, it's not showing up in their system." Sarah's impatience was evident. "Can you just wire the money directly? It's $22,000 for the semester." $22,000, the amount that my sister was asking me to casually wire on a Sunday evening was roughly equivalent to what many families earned in half a year. It was also approximately the cost of the chemotherapy drugs I would begin receiving the next day, though my insurance would cover most of that. "I'm actually headed out of town early tomorrow," I said. "I'll look into it when I get back on Wednesday." "Out of town? Again? Jen, this is important. Tyler can't register for classes without the payment, and all the good sections will be filled if he has to wait until Wednesday." The irony wasn't lost on me. My nephew's class schedule was apparently more urgent than anything I might be dealing with. "I've got a medical appointment that can't be rescheduled," I said, deciding to offer a partial truth. "I'll handle Tyler's tuition as soon as I'm back." There was a pause on the line. Here it was, the moment where Sarah would ask about this. Medical appointment, express concern, perhaps offer assistance. "Medical appointment? Are you finally getting that knee looked at?" she asked, referencing a minor complaint I'd mentioned months ago at a family dinner. "Anyway, can't you just log in and do the wire transfer from your phone?" It would just take a minute. And there it was, the confirmation of exactly where I stood in my family's priorities. Not even worth a genuine inquiry about my health. "I'll handle it Wednesday, Sarah," I repeated, my voice firm. "I need to finish packing now. Give my love to the kids." I ended the call before she could press further. Monday morning, Elena picked me up at 7:30 a.m. for my 8:15 appointment. The Portland Cancer Center was located across town, its modern glass exterior designed to let in maximum natural light. A small mercy for those spending long hours inside receiving treatment. "I brought you these," Elena said as we drove, handing me a small gift bag. Inside was a soft blue cashmere beanie, a silk scarf, and a journal with a beautiful leather cover. "Dr. Harrison said your hair might start falling out after a few sessions, and I thought, well, I wanted you to have options, and the journal is for thoughts, good days, bad days, whatever you need to process." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I managed, clutching the gifts in my lap. The treatment room was arranged with recliners positioned around the perimeter, each with its own TV screen, small side, table, and privacy curtain if desired. As the nurse inserted the IV line that would deliver the powerful drugs designed to kill the rapidly dividing cells in my body, both cancerous and, unfortunately, some healthy ones, I found myself scanning the room. There were 8 other patients receiving treatment that day. Some were alone, reading books or dozing. Others had companions, spouses holding hands, adult children chatting softly, friends bringing magazines and snacks. Normal, I thought. This is what normal support looks like. Ms. Parker, could you confirm your date of birth for me? The nurse's voice brought me back to the present as she prepared to start the infusion. July 15th, 1971, I replied, watching as she checked the information against my wristband. Perfect. We're going to start with pre-medications to help with any potential reactions, and then begin the actual chemotherapy drugs. The whole process will take about 4 hours. If you need anything at all, just press this button. As the first medications began flowing into my veins, I opened the new journal Elena had given me and began to write. Not about the cancer or the treatment, but about the decisions I had made and the ones still to come. About the foundation I was establishing, the legacy I wanted to leave, and the boundaries I was finally setting. Elena sat quietly beside me, occasionally offering water or adjusting my blanket, but mostly respecting my need for reflection. 4 hours stretched into 5 as the final medications were administered, and we waited to ensure I didn't have any immediate adverse reactions. By the time we left, the fatigue was overwhelming, but something else had begun to take root alongside it. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being the family provider and everything to do with authenticity. Would you like me to take you to Sarah's? Elena asked as we approached the car. You probably shouldn't be alone tonight, just in case you have any delayed reactions. I shook my head. No, they don't know, and I'm not ready to tell them yet. The admission should have felt shameful, I supposed, but it didn't. Could you stay at my place instead? The guest room is made up. Elena smiled. I already packed a bag. It's in the trunk. That night, as the first waves of nausea hit and Elena brought cool washcloths and ginger tea, I made another decision. I would give my family one more chance, one opportunity to show that they could be something more than financial dependence. Not because they deserved it, but because I needed to know for certain that the path I was choosing was the right one. The next morning, feeling marginally better, I called a family meeting for Saturday at my home. Important business matters to discuss, I told each of them, knowing that the promise of financial conversation would ensure their attendance in a way that nothing else would. Michael was the first to ask, "Is this about the trust distribution? Because Sarah mentioned you've been putting her off about Tyler's tuition." "Among other things," I replied vaguely. "Saturday at 2. Please make sure you're all there." For the next few days, I worked remotely when I could, resting when I couldn't. The side effects were manageable but unpleasant. Fatigue that made even showering an exhausting task, nausea that came in unpredictable waves, and a persistent metallic taste that made eating difficult. Elena coordinated with my assistant at the firm to reschedule meetings and handle urgent matters, all while preparing my home for Saturday's gathering. By Saturday morning, I had recovered enough to dress carefully in loose-fitting but elegant clothes that concealed my slightly thinner frame. I applied makeup to add color to my pallid cheeks and arranged my hair to hide the slight thinning that had already begun at the temples. In the mirror, I looked almost like my usual self, though my eyes held a new resolve that couldn't be disguised. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Elena opened it to admit my family. Michael and his wife Rebecca, Sarah and her husband, James, David, and, somewhat surprisingly, my adult nieces and nephews, Tyler, Amber, Zoe, Lucas, and Olivia. They filed into my living room, helping themselves to the refreshments Elena had arranged, their chatter filling the space with familiar noise. "All right, Jen," Michael said once everyone was settled, checking his watch not so subtly. "We're all here. What's this about? Is there a problem with the trust?" I looked around at their faces, family who had known me their entire lives, yet somehow failed to notice that anything was wrong. despite the changes in my appearance, my energy, my availability. These were the people who called me first when they needed money, but last, if at all, when celebrating good news or seeking emotional support. Yes and no, I began, sitting in the armchair that faced the large sofa where most of them had gathered. There are going to be some changes to how things are managed going forward. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What kind of changes? You're not thinking of selling the firm, are you? Because Dad always intended— This isn't about Dad's intentions, I interrupted, a sharpness in my voice that caused several of them to blink in surprise. This is about current realities. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what came next. This was the moment of truth, the one opportunity I was giving them to show me who they really were, what our relationship actually meant beyond the financial transactions that had defined it for too long. 3 weeks ago, I was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Their faces registered shock, confusion, disbelief. I had surgery 2 weeks ago to remove as much of the tumor as possible. On Monday, I began chemotherapy, which I'll continue every 3 weeks for the next several months. I kept my voice steady, clinical almost, as if presenting a particularly challenging financial projection to clients. Sarah was the first to find her voice. Cancer? But how? You seem fine. I'm not fine, I replied simply. I've lost 12 pounds. I can barely stay awake past 8 o'clock. And on Monday, I sat through 5 hours of toxic chemicals being pumped into my body. Alone. Except for Elena. Why didn't you tell us? Michael demanded, his tone suggesting I had somehow wronged them by keeping my illness private. Why didn't you notice? I countered. The question hung in the air between us, uncomfortable and accusing. My niece Amber's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of regret for including the younger generation in this confrontation. We've all been busy, Rebecca offered weakly. Summer schedules are crazy. Too busy to notice that. The person who manages your trust fund, pays for your children's education, and organizes every family gathering has been visibly ill for months. The bitterness I'd been suppressing slipped into my voice. Too busy to ask a single question about my life, my health, my well-being? David stood up abruptly. This isn't fair, Jen. You can't just spring something like this on us and then blame us for not being mind readers. If you needed help, you should have asked. I laughed, a short, harsh sound that seemed to surprise even me. Like you ask when you need money, or when you need advice, or when you need someone to bail out. Your children? I looked at Tyler, who had the decency to look embarrassed about his DUI last year that I had quietly handled. The difference is, I've always responded to your needs. Every time you've asked, I've been there. That's different, Sarah protested. Those are practical matters. This is medical. Private. So private that you didn't think to ask why I wasn't drinking at Amber's graduation party? Or why I've lost enough weight that my clothes don't fit? Or why I've been out of town more in the past month than in the past year? I shook my head. It's not about mind reading, Sarah. It's about basic human concern. Silence fell again, heavier this time. My nephew Lucas, always the most sensitive of the bunch, moved from the sofa to perch on the arm of my chair, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. It was the first genuine gesture of support from any of them, and I reached up to squeeze his fingers in acknowledgement. What can we do? He asked quietly. How can we help now? It was the question I had been waiting for, the opening I had hoped someone would provide. Not demands for information about the trust or accusations about my failure to disclose my illness, but a simple offer of support. Now we talk about how things are going to change, I said, my voice gentler. Both during my treatment and going forward, regardless of the outcome. For the next hour, I outlined the new reality. I would be stepping back from day-to-day management of the firm, with Elena taking over many of my responsibilities. The trustee duties would be temporarily transferred to Thomas Whitfield, removing my siblings' direct access to funds beyond their established quarterly distributions. There would be no more emergency loans, no more special requests, no more financial bailouts. But what about Tyler's tuition? Sarah asked, her priorities painfully clear. And Zoe's planning to study abroad in the spring. The scheduled educational expenses will continue as established, I assured her, though I noted with disappointment that this was her primary concern. But any additional funds will need to be approved by Thomas, based on the original trust guidelines. Michael looked increasingly agitated. This sounds like you don't trust us to manage our own affairs. I don't, I said bluntly. Because you haven't? For 12 years, I've covered every financial gap, solved every money problem, enabled every poor decision. That stops now. Not just because I'm sick, but because it isn't healthy for any of us. And what about your will? David asked, the question hanging inappropriately in the air. I mean, not that we're thinking about that, but since we're discussing legal changes. Elena, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, made a small sound of disbelief. I caught her eye and gave a slight nod, confirmation that this was exactly why I had made the changes I had. My personal estate is being restructured, I said carefully. The details aren't important right now. What matters is how we move forward from here. You're my family, and despite everything, I love you. But love doesn't mean enabling dependency, and it certainly doesn't mean accepting one-sided relationships. I stood, signaling that the formal portion of our gathering was over. I have another chemotherapy session on Monday. If anyone would like to accompany me, I'd welcome the company. If not, I understand. But going forward, I need more from this family than financial requests. I need actual support, actual interest, actual relationship. Those who provide that will find me as generous as I've always been, in all the ways that truly matter. The reactions varied. Sarah quickly volunteered to drive me to Monday's appointment, though her offer felt more like obligation than genuine desire. Michael muttered something about checking his calendar. David asked if I had good insurance or if I would need help with medical bills, still focusing on money, missing the larger point entirely. It was my nieces and nephews who surprised me most. Amber knelt by my chair after most of the adults had moved to the kitchen for more drinks, clearly processing the weight of what had happened. I've been so selfish, she said quietly. All those times you asked about my classes, my friends, my plans. And I never once asked about your life. She looked up, her young face troubled. I didn't even say thank you for the college fund. Not really. I just expected it. I touched her cheek gently. You're young. Learning to see beyond yourself is part of growing up. I'd like to come on Monday, she said with determination. And maybe you could teach me about the business sometime? I'm considering finance as my major, and I never even thought to ask you about it when you're literally running a financial empire. A small but genuine smile formed on my lips. I'd like that very much. As my family gradually departed that afternoon, their reactions told me everything I needed to know about the changes I had made to my will. Sarah and Michael left with tight smiles and vague promises to check in. David lingered, asking pointed questions about the trust restructuring that I deflected smoothly. But Amber, Lucas, and somewhat surprisingly, Zoe, made concrete plans to join a rotation of support during my treatment. Elena closed the door behind the last of them and returned to the living room where I sat, suddenly exhausted by the emotional exertion. Well, she said, settling beside me on the sofa, that went about as expected. I nodded, leaning back against the cushions. It did, which confirms I made the right decision. With the will? With everything. I closed my eyes, briefly. The foundation will do good work. The scholarship programs at the universities will help students who don't have family support. The Charitable Remainder Trust will ensure that those who actually step up during this time are taken care of. I opened my eyes and looked at Elena. And you'll run the company better than Michael ever would have. We don't need to think about all that yet, she said firmly. You're going to beat this, Jennifer. And then you'll have years to watch your nieces and nephews grow into the kind of adults who deserve your guidance, and maybe your legacy. Maybe, I thought. But regardless of the outcome, whether I survived this cancer or not, I had finally done something purely for myself. I had recognized my own worth and demanded that others do the same. I had established boundaries that should have been in place years ago, and I had ensured that my life's work would continue to reflect my values, with or without my physical presence. The journal Elena had given me sat on the coffee table. I reached for it, opening to the first page where I had begun writing on Monday during my treatment. The words I had written then seemed prophetic now. Today is the first day of my new life, however long or short that might be. Today, I stop being the family ATM and start being the author of my own story. As the evening light filtered through the windows of my Portland home, painting the walls in warm gold, I added a new entry. The truest legacy isn't measured in dollars distributed, but in values demonstrated. Those who show up during the hardest days are the ones who deserve to carry those values forward. Today, I saw clearly who those people might be, and who they definitely are not. And for the first time in years, I feel completely at peace with my choices. Jennifer, come join us for the toast! My brother Michael's voice boomed across the room. He stood with our sister Sarah and brother David, champagne glasses raised as they prepared to celebrate Amber's accomplishments. I forced a smile and approached, ignoring the dizziness that had become my constant companion over the past few months, a symptom I'd dismissed as stress from managing the family's financial consulting firm. To Amber, Michael announced, for making us all proud and for her bright future at Stanford. The crowd cheered, and glasses clinked. I sipped my water, the doctor's instructions to avoid alcohol still fresh in my mind. Aunt Jen, aren't you having champagne? Amber asked, her forehead creasing with mild concern, the first anyone had shown me all evening. Just pacing myself, sweetheart. Big meeting tomorrow, I lied smoothly. At 52, I'd perfected the art of putting others at ease, of making my own discomfort invisible. Sarah leaned in, her expensive perfume almost overwhelming. Speaking of meetings, David and I were hoping to talk to you about increasing the quarterly distributions from Dad's trust. College expenses are really adding up, and with David's renovation project. Of course, no conversation with my siblings was complete without a request for money. As the executor of our parents' estate and the only financially responsible sibling, I'd spent the past 12 years managing the family's considerable assets, including the successful financial consulting firm our father had built. My siblings had received generous distributions but always seemed to need more, their lifestyles consistently exceeding even the substantial allowances from the trust. We can discuss it next week, I replied, suddenly exhausted. I'm not making any financial decisions tonight. What I didn't say was that I'd spent the morning meeting with my own financial advisors, reorganizing my affairs in preparation for what might come. David frowned, his hand tightening around his champagne flute. It's not really a big deal, Jen. Just a small adjustment to the distribution schedule. Next week, I repeated firmly, watching as my siblings exchanged glances. They weren't used to me refusing their requests, especially not at family gatherings where keeping the peace had always been my responsibility. As I excused myself to get some fresh air, I stepped onto the community center's small terrace. The evening air was cooling rapidly as dusk settled over Portland, bringing with it the scent of rain and distant pine. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, wishing I'd brought something warmer but grateful for the moment of solitude. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Another text from Elena. "Don't forget to eat something. Dr. Harrison said maintaining your strength is crucial." Elena Martinez had been my executive assistant for nearly 9 years. She'd started fresh out of business school, bright and ambitious, and quickly became indispensable not just to the firm, but to me personally. At 35, she was like the daughter I never had, perceptive, efficient, and fiercely loyal. When the doctor called with my preliminary results, Elena had been organizing quarterly reports in my office. She'd seen the color drain from my face, heard me ask for the biopsy results to be sent immediately, and had simply closed the door to give me privacy. Later that evening, she'd shown up at my doorstep with research on the best oncologists in the Northwest and 3 types of ginger. Tea for nausea. "Just stepped outside. We'll grab a plate soon," I texted back, knowing she would follow up if I didn't. The door to the terrace opened, spilling warm light and the sounds of celebration. My nephew Lucas, Sarah's middle child, stepped out with 2 plates of food. "Aunt Jen, Mom said you're not feeling well." He handed me one of the plates. "I brought you some of that salmon you always like." Lucas had always been different from the rest, more observant, less entitled. At 20, he was studying environmental science at the State University, the only one of my nieces and nephews who hadn't insisted on an expensive private college. He'd also been the only one to send a handwritten thank you note for the modest car I'd helped him purchase last year. "Thank you, Lucas. That was thoughtful." I took the plate, realizing I hadn't eaten since a light breakfast. "How are your classes going?" He leaned against the railing beside me. "Good. Challenging, but in the right ways." He hesitated. "Aunt Jen, are you really okay? You seem, I don't know, different lately." For a brief moment, I considered telling him the truth. Lucas might actually care, might actually offer genuine support. But the terrace door opened again, and Sarah poked her head out. "There you are. Jen, the Hartmans are asking about that investment opportunity you mentioned last month. Can you come speak with them? And Lucas, Amber's about to cut the cake. She wants all the cousins for photos." The moment passed. I set the barely touched plate on a nearby table and followed my sister inside, back into the noise and demands and pretense. Lucas gave me a concerned glance before joining his cousins, leaving me to field questions about portfolio diversification from family friends who saw me as nothing more than a convenient financial advisor, even at a celebration. By the time I arrived home that night, the emotional toll of maintaining appearances had left me completely drained. My modern townhouse in the Pearl District, all clean lines, hardwood floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the Willamette River, had always been my sanctuary. Tonight, it felt impossibly empty. I kicked off my heels in the entryway and moved to the kitchen, where my reflection caught in the darkened window above the sink. How had no one noticed? The hollowness in my cheeks, the shadows beneath my eyes, the way my clothes hung just slightly looser than before. Was I truly that invisible to them, or had they simply grown so accustomed to taking what they needed that they no longer saw me at all? My surgery was scheduled for Monday morning, just 3 days away. The plan was to remove as much of the tumor as possible before beginning chemotherapy. Dr. Harrison had explained that with stage 3 ovarian cancer, some microscopic cancer cells almost certainly remained in my abdominal cavity. The chemotherapy would be my best chance at eliminating those cells and preventing recurrence. I opened my refrigerator, staring absently at the contents. Elena had stocked it with prepared meals from a service that specialized in nutrition for cancer patients. The rainbow of containers seemed to mock me with their cheerful colors and promises of healing ingredients. How strange to think that my assistant had made more practical preparations for my treatment than my own family. The landline rang, the private number few people had. I picked up, expecting Elena with a final reminder about tomorrow's pre-op appointment. "Jennifer? It's Thomas. Thomas Whitfield." The family attorney's voice sounded concerned. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Thomas. Is everything all right?" "I was about to ask you the same thing. I ran into Rebecca at the farmer's market this morning. She mentioned something about you seeming off at Amber's party and... Well, I know it's not my place, but I've known you since your father's days. If there's anything you need..." Thomas had been my father's closest friend and attorney for over 40 years. Now in his 70s, he still maintained a small practice, primarily handling our family's legal matters. He was one of the few people who had expressed genuine concern when my father passed away 12 years ago, and one of even fewer who had noticed how completely the burden of the family's financial management had fallen on my shoulders. "Actually, Thomas," I said after a momentary hesitation, "there is something. I'd like to meet with you on Tuesday if possible, to discuss some changes to my will and the trust structure." "Of course." His voice sharpened with professional interest. "Is this about the quarterly distributions?" "David called my office this afternoon, rather insistent about some adjustment." Of course he had. Not even 24 hours had passed, and already David was trying to circumvent my authority. "It's about much more than that. I've had some health news. I'd prefer to discuss it in person." The silence on the line spoke volumes. Thomas had been a lawyer long enough to recognize the gravity in those words. "I see," he said finally. "I'll clear my morning schedule. Come whenever you're able." "Thank you, Thomas. And I'd appreciate your discretion. The family doesn't know yet." After we hung up, I moved through my evening routine mechanically, washing my face, laying out clothes for the pre-op appointment tomorrow, reviewing the list of medications and supplements I needed to stop before surgery. The normalcy of these actions felt surreal against the backdrop of what was happening inside my body. In my home office, I opened my laptop to review some files I'd brought home. The document that appeared on screen was one I'd been working on, intermittently for weeks, a comprehensive overview of the Parker Family Trust, its assets, distribution schedules, and management structure. I'd created it initially as a reference tool, something to help my siblings better understand the complexities of our shared inheritance. Now, staring at the spreadsheets and legal paragraphs, I saw it differently. This document represented years of my life dedicated to preserving and growing my father's legacy, not just for myself, but for siblings who treated the resulting wealth as an entitlement rather than a privilege, for nieces and nephews who accepted expensive educations and lavish gifts without understanding the work that made them possible, for a family that saw me as a resource rather than a person. I closed the file without saving my recent edits. The structure I'd so carefully maintained was about to change, and not in the ways my siblings were hoping. Morning came with a pounding, headache, and a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my diagnosis and everything to do with stress. As I showered and dressed in comfortable clothes for the pre-op appointment, my mind kept returning to the revelation I'd had the night before. I had spent so long taking care of everyone else's needs that I had forgotten how to advocate for my own. Elena arrived promptly at 8:30, armed with a folder of medical documents and a travel mug of ginger tea. "I've rescheduled your meetings through next Wednesday," she said as we drove across town to the Portland Medical Center. "The Johnson account review has been pushed to next month, and I've prepared statements explaining your temporary absence to key clients." "What did you tell them?" I asked, watching rain begin to speckle the windshield. "That you're taking a brief medical leave. No details provided." She glanced at me. "I've also set up remote access systems so you can review critical documents from home during your recovery, though Dr. Harrison strongly recommends complete rest for at least the first week." I smiled faintly. Always 10 steps ahead. "Someone has to be," she replied, "especially since your family seems determined to remain 10 steps behind." The pre-op appointment was straightforward but sobering. Dr. Harrison's surgical nurse reviewed the procedure in detail: the incision, the expected removal of both ovaries and fallopian tubes, the potential for removing portions of other affected organs if cancer had spread further than the scans indicated. She explained what to expect during recovery, the limitations on movement, the drainage tubes that would remain for several days. Elena took notes on everything, asking practical questions that hadn't occurred to me. Who would change the dressings? What signs might indicate infection? What foods would be best during initial recovery? How soon could normal work activities resume, even remotely? As we left the hospital, armed with prescriptions and preparation instructions, Elena turned to me. "Jennifer, I think you should tell them." I didn't need to ask who them was. They'll find out soon enough. But wouldn't it be better coming from you before the surgery? What if... She stopped herself, but the unspoken concern hung between us. What if something went wrong? What if the cancer was more extensive than expected? What if this was more serious than we were allowing ourselves to acknowledge? I'll tell them Sunday, I decided. I'll host dinner at my place after the surgery is done. Elena looked skeptical. Why wait? Because I need to see them as they truly are one more time, I replied, without the performance of concern that a cancer announcement would trigger. I need to be certain about the changes I'm planning to make. Saturday morning brought a flurry of calls and texts from my siblings, not inquiring about my health or well-being, but following up on the financial requests they'd made at Amber's party. Sarah wanted to know if I'd looked into Tyler's tuition payment. David needed approval for additional funds for his home renovation. Michael was asking about restructuring his portion of the trust to invest in yet another business venture, despite his 3 previous failures. I responded to each with brief non-committal messages. We'll discuss next week. Looking into options. Need to review terms with Thomas. Their increasingly frustrated replies only strengthened my resolve. By Saturday afternoon, I'd finalized my preparations for Monday's surgery. My refrigerator was stocked, my medical leave paperwork filed, my hospital bag packed. Elena had arranged for a professional cleaning service to come Wednesday, after I returned home, and had coordinated with a private nursing service for the first few days of my recovery. All practical matters were handled. All that remained was to prepare emotionally for whatever came next, both with the cancer and with my family. Sunday dawned clear and unexpectedly warm for early June. I spent the morning on my small balcony, sipping tea and watching the river traffic below. Sailboats and kayaks dotted the Willamette, their occupants taking advantage of the rare sunshine. From this height, they looked like colorful toys, their movements carefree and aimless. I had invited my siblings for an early dinner at 5i, claiming a work conflict later in the evening. In truth, I needed to be in bed early to follow the pre-surgical instructions for midnight fasting. Elena had arranged for a catering service to deliver and set up, allowing me to conserve my energy for the conversation ahead. At precisely 4:57, the doorbell rang. Michael and Rebecca were always punctual, a trait I appreciated despite our other differences. Sarah and James arrived moments later, followed closely by David, who came alone as his current girlfriend was taking space to reevaluate their dynamic, whatever that meant. "No kids tonight?" Rebecca asked as she accepted a glass of sparkling water from Elena, who was playing the role of attentive assistant rather than the confidant she had become. "Just us," I confirmed. "There are some business matters I wanted to discuss privately." Michael brightened visibly. "About the trust distributions? I've been thinking about that structure, and I really believe we could optimize returns if we—" "Let's eat first," I interrupted gently. "There's plenty of time to discuss business." The catered meal was elegant but simple. Roasted salmon, seasonal vegetables, fresh bread from the artisanal bakery my siblings loved but complained was ridiculously overpriced. The conversation flowed easily enough, centered primarily around neighborhood gossip, Amber's college preparations, and David's latest dating woes. Not once during the main course did anyone ask about my life, my work, or my health. Not even when I declined the wine that Rebecca had brought, a vintage I usually enjoyed. Not even when I excused myself briefly after the main course, needing a moment to gather my strength for what was to come. In the privacy of my bedroom, I pressed a cool washcloth to my face and took several deep breaths. The constant fatigue of recent weeks was magnified by the emotional strain of the evening. Part of me wanted to simply ask them to leave, to send a group text tomorrow from the hospital revealing my diagnosis and surgery. But that would be the easy way out, and I needed to look them in the eyes when I told them. I needed to see their unfiltered reactions. When I returned to the dining room, Elena was serving coffee and the simple fruit tart I'd requested in lieu of anything heavier. Perfect timing, Sarah smiled. We were just debating whether to start the business discussion without you. David has a date later. Apparently, the reevaluation period was shorter than expected. I resumed my seat at the head of the table, the position I'd inherited from our father both literally and figuratively. Actually, the business matters will need to wait. There's something more important we need to discuss. Something in my tone must have finally pierced their self-absorption. All three of my siblings straightened slightly, their expressions shifting from casual interest to cautious attention. Is everything all right with the firm? Michael asked immediately. Always the first to worry about the money. The firm is fine, I assured him. This is personal. I hesitated, suddenly unsure how to say the words I'd been rehearsing all day. There was no gentle way to drop this bomb into the middle of our comfortable family dinner. I've been diagnosed with ovarian cancer, stage 3. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. David's fork clattered against his dessert plate. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth in what appeared to be genuine shock. That's not funny, Jen, Michael said finally, his voice strained. I'm not joking. I kept my voice steady, clinical almost. I received the diagnosis 2 weeks ago. I'm having surgery tomorrow morning to remove the primary tumor, followed by chemotherapy. Sarah set her cup down with exaggerated care. 2 weeks? You've known for 2 weeks and you're just telling us now? The night before surgery? Of all the responses I'd anticipated, indignation wasn't high on the list. But perhaps I should have expected it. Sarah had always been remarkably skilled at turning any situation into a narrative where she was somehow wronged. Yes, I said simply. I needed time to process the information and make practical arrangements. But we're your family, David protested, looking genuinely hurt for the first time in our adult relationship. You should have told us immediately. I studied their faces, the shock, the confusion, the beginnings of what might be actual concern. And beneath it all, the unmistakable calculation that I'd seen countless times in business negotiations. They were already thinking about what this meant for them. Would you have noticed if I hadn't told you at all? I asked quietly. At Amber's graduation, I was pale, nauseous, and exhausted. I didn't touch the champagne or the food. Not one of you asked if I was feeling all right. Not one of you has called in the past 2 weeks except to discuss trust distributions or tuition payments. Michael flushed. That's not fair. We've all been busy and you always seem so capable, so in control. Because that's what you've needed me to be, I replied. The steady one, the responsible one, the one who manages everything without complaint. What can we do? Rebecca asked, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Do you need help? With medical expenses? The best specialists? I withdrew my hand gently. I have excellent insurance, and I've already engaged one of the top gynecologic oncologists in the Northwest. What I need isn't financial assistance. Then what? Sarah asked, her voice softer now. Just tell us what you need, Jen. The irony of her finally asking this question, after decades of taking without asking, wasn't lost on me. But this wasn't the moment for bitterness or recriminations. This was about setting a new course, establishing a new reality. I need space to focus on my health, I said clearly. Starting tomorrow, Elena will be handling the day-to-day operations of the firm. Thomas Whitfield will be temporarily overseeing the trust administration. All scheduled distributions will continue as planned, but any additional requests will need to go through him, not me. David began to protest, but Michael silenced him with a look. Of course, my older brother said, clearly attempting to strike the proper sympathetic tone. Whatever makes this easier for you. How long do they expect your recovery to take? And there it was. Not, how serious is this? Or, what's your prognosis? But, when will you be back to taking care of our needs? I had given him the perfect opportunity to show genuine concern, and he had immediately defaulted to practicalities. That depends, I said carefully. On the surgery results, on how I respond to chemotherapy, on whether the cancer has spread further than the scans show. I paused, meeting each of their eyes. In turn, on whether I have the emotional support necessary to focus on healing rather than worrying about everyone else's financial concerns. Sarah at least had the grace to look embarrassed. Of course you have our support. You should have told us sooner. We would have been there for you from the beginning. Would they? I had my doubts. But this wasn't the time to voice them. I'm telling you now, my surgery is scheduled for 7:30 tomorrow morning at Portland Medical Center. I'll be in recovery most of the day, but able to have visitors briefly tomorrow evening if anyone wants to come. I'll be there, David said immediately, so quickly it almost seemed genuine. What time? Visiting hours end at 8 guys. Elena will be coordinating updates throughout the day if you want to check in. Of course we'll all be there, Michael declared, looking at his wife and sister for confirmation. They nodded automatically, like employees agreeing with a boss's suggestion. As the reality of my announcement settled over the table, the atmosphere shifted. My siblings began asking questions, some relevant, some clearly designed to demonstrate appropriate concern. How had I discovered it? What were the treatment protocols? Had I gotten a second opinion? Would I need to move temporarily to be closer to the hospital? I answered each question patiently, noticing how their response had transformed from initial shock to something resembling a business meeting, gathering information, analyzing implications, strategizing next steps. It was the only way they knew how to process difficulty, I realized, through the lens of practical problems to be solved. Only Rebecca, ironically the family member to whom I felt least connected, seemed to understand the emotional weight of what was happening. Are you scared? She asked softly during a lull in the practical questions. The directness of her question caught me off guard. Was I scared? Of course I was. Terrified of the surgery, the treatment, the uncertain prognosis. Afraid of pain and sickness and the possibility, however remote Dr. Harrison insisted it was, of death. But I'd been so focused on practical preparations and family dynamics that I'd barely allowed myself to acknowledge the fear. Yes, I admitted, my voice smaller than I intended. But I'm trying not to dwell on it. Rebecca nodded, reaching for my hand again. This time, I let her take it. That's understandable, but it's okay to be scared. It's okay to lean on people. Even people who haven't always been there for you in the ways they should have been. Her words, gentle but pointed, cast a pall over the table. My siblings shifted uncomfortably, perhaps finally recognizing the patterns that had defined our relationship for so long. I appreciate that, I said sincerely, and I hope you're right. As the evening drew to a close, practical matters resurfaced. Who would drive me to the hospital? Elena already arranged. Who would stay with me after discharge? A private nurse for the first few days. Had I updated my advance directive and healthcare power of attorney? Yes. Meeting with Thomas on Tuesday. The mention of Thomas reminded me of the other changes. I was planning the restructuring of my will, the new limitations on trust distributions, the transfer of operational control of the firm. But those conversations could wait. Tonight had been about delivering the diagnosis and observing their initial unfiltered reactions. Tuesday's meeting with Thomas would set the rest in motion. As my siblings gathered their coats and made promises to visit tomorrow evening, I stood in my entryway feeling strangely detached. Their concern, now that it had finally emerged, felt performative. The right things said at the right time, but without the depth that comes from genuine connection. David hugged me awkwardly, patting my back like I was an acquaintance he was, greeting at a networking event. Try not to worry. Modern medicine works wonders these days. Sarah embraced me more fully but whispered, "Why didn't you just tell us at Amber's party? We could have helped you prepare." Michael, ever the eldest, tried for authoritative reassurance. "We'll handle everything. You just focus on getting better." Only Rebecca seemed to understand what I might actually need. "Call if you need anything. Anytime, even just to talk." After they left, Elena emerged from the kitchen where she'd been tactfully keeping herself occupied. "How do you feel?" she asked, helping me clear the last few dishes. "Tired," I admitted, "but clearer." "Did they react as you expected?" I considered the question carefully. Yes and no. They showed concern, but it was, I don't know, surface, level, performative. Like they knew they should be worried but weren't sure how to actually feel it, she suggested. Exactly. I sank onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. They've spent so long thinking of me as the solution to their problems that they don't know how to handle me becoming a problem to be solved. Elena sat beside me. "You're not a problem, Jennifer. You're a person facing a health crisis. There's a difference." "Not to them, there isn't." I sighed. The first questions were all about when I'd be back to managing everything, not about my prognosis or how I was coping. "And that confirms your decision about the will?" I nodded slowly. "I think so. Not out of spite or punishment, but because it's revealed something important about our relationship. They see me as a resource, not as family." "Not really." I turned to look at her directly. "The changes I'm planning, they're about aligning my legacy with my values, about recognizing who's actually been family to me, regardless of blood." "They might surprise you," Elena said cautiously. "Crisis can bring out different sides of people." "It can," I agreed. "And I'm willing to be surprised. But I'm not going to keep enabling patterns that have been harmful to all of us." We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the last light fade from the sky outside my windows. Tomorrow would bring the first of many challenges: the surgery, the recovery, the beginning of a treatment journey with no guaranteed outcome. But tonight had brought clarity about another journey, one that had been decades in the making. The redefinition of what family meant to me, and what obligations I did and didn't have to those who shared my blood. "I should get to bed," I said, finally, standing with effort. "Early morning tomorrow." Elena nodded, gathering her things. "I'll be here at 5:30 to drive you. Try to rest." After she left, I moved through my evening routine one final time as a person with all her original parts intact. Tomorrow, I would wake up different, physically altered, medically compromised, but perhaps emotionally stronger for having finally confronted the truths I'd been avoiding for years. As I climbed into bed and set my alarm, I thought again of Rebecca's unexpected question. Was I scared? Yes. But fear wasn't the dominant emotion as I faced tomorrow's surgery and the uncertain future beyond it. Instead, I felt something approaching peace, the calm that comes from finally acknowledging truths long buried. I was fighting two battles simultaneously: one against the cancer growing inside me, and one against the patterns of obligation and enabling I'd allowed to define my family relationships. Only one of these battles had a clear medical protocol. The other would require a different kind of surgery altogether, cutting away expectations and dependencies that had grown as insidiously as any tumor. Tomorrow would bring pain, uncertainty, and the beginning of a difficult recovery. But it would also bring the opportunity to rebuild, not just my health, but my life. To create boundaries that should have existed long ago. To define family by actions rather than blood. As sleep finally claimed me, my last coherent thought was a strange one. That perhaps this diagnosis, terrible as it was, might ultimately give me something I'd never fully possessed: freedom. The door to the terrace opened, spilling warm light and the sounds of celebration. My nephew Lucas, Sarah's middle child, stepped out with 2 plates of food. "Aunt Jen? Mom said you're not feeling well." He handed me one of the plates. "I brought you some of that salmon you always like." Lucas had always been different from the rest, more observant, less entitled. At 20, he was studying environmental science at the State University, the only one of my nieces and nephews who hadn't insisted on an expensive private college. Not to them, there isn't. I sighed. The first questions were all about when I'd be back to managing everything, not about my prognosis or how I was coping. "And that confirms your decision about the will?" I nodded slowly. "I think so. Not out of spite or punishment, but because it's revealed something important about our relationship. They see me as a resource, not as family." "Not really." I turned to look at her directly. "The changes I'm planning, they're about aligning my legacy with my values, about recognizing who's actually been family to me, regardless of blood." "They might surprise you," Elena said cautiously. "Crisis can bring out different sides of people." "It can," I agreed. "And I'm willing to be surprised. But I'm not going to keep enabling patterns that have been harmful to all of us." We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the last light fade from the sky outside my windows. Tomorrow would bring the first of many challenges: the surgery, the recovery, the beginning of a treatment journey with no guaranteed outcome. But tonight had brought clarity about another journey, one that had been decades in the making: the redefinition of what family meant to me and what obligations I did and didn't have to those who shared my blood. "I should get to bed," I said, finally, standing with effort. "Early morning tomorrow." Elena nodded, gathering her things. "I'll be here at 5:30 to drive you. Try to rest." After she left, I moved through my evening routine one final time as a person with all her original parts intact. Tomorrow, I would wake up different, physically altered, medically compromised, but perhaps emotionally stronger for having finally confronted the truths I'd been avoiding for years. As I climbed into bed and set my alarm, I thought again of Rebecca's unexpected question. Was I scared? Yes, but fear wasn't the dominant emotion as I faced tomorrow's surgery and the uncertain future beyond it. Instead, I felt something approaching peace, the calm that comes from finally acknowledging truths long buried. I was fighting 2 battles simultaneously, one against the cancer growing inside me, and one against the patterns of obligation and enabling I'd allowed to define my family relationships. Only one of these battles had a clear medical protocol. The other would require a different kind of surgery altogether, cutting away expectations and dependencies that had grown as insidiously as any tumor. Tomorrow would bring pain. He'd also been the only one to send a handwritten thank you note for the modest car I'd helped him purchase last year. "Thank you, Lucas. That was thoughtful." I took the plate, realizing I hadn't eaten since a light breakfast. "How are your classes going?" He leaned against the railing beside me. "Good. Challenging, but in the right ways." He hesitated. "Aunt Jen, are you really okay? You seem, I don't know, different lately." For a brief moment, I considered telling him the truth. Lucas might actually care, might actually offer genuine support. But the terrace door opened again, and Sarah poked her head out. "There you are. Jen, the Hartmans are asking about that investment opportunity you mentioned last month. Can you come speak with them? And Lucas, Amber's about to cut the cake. She wants all the cousins for photos." The moment passed. I set the barely touched plate on a nearby table and followed my sister inside, back into the noise and demands and pretense. Lucas gave me a concerned glance before joining his cousins, leaving me to field questions about portfolio diversification from family friends who saw me as nothing more than a convenient financial advisor, even at a celebration. Monday morning arrived with a gray drizzle tapping against my bedroom windows. I woke before my alarm, a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with my diagnosis. The conversation with my siblings last night had gone exactly as I'd anticipated. Initial shock and concern quickly giving way to practical questions about how my illness would affect them. Not one of them had asked how I was feeling emotionally. Not one had offered to accompany me to treatment beyond the obligatory hospital visit they'd promised for this evening. As I showered and dressed in the comfortable clothes Elena had suggested, for my first chemotherapy session, loose cotton pants, a button-up shirt for easy access to my newly installed port, and a light cardigan that could be removed if I got too warm, I tried to quiet the voice of disappointment in my head. What had I expected, really? That a cancer diagnosis would suddenly transform my siblings into different people? That years of self-centered behavior would dissolve in the face of my illness? The doorbell rang precisely at 7:30. Elena was nothing if not punctual. I opened the door to find her balancing a drink carrier with 2 travel mugs and a small paper bag that emitted the scent of freshly baked pastries. "Ginger tea with honey," she said, handing me one of the mugs, "and almond croissants from that bakery on Thurman Street. Dr. Harrison said a light breakfast might help prevent nausea during treatment." "You didn't have to do all this," I said, though I was genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. "I know." She shrugged, setting down her bag and removing her raincoat. "But someone should be doing it, and I'm here." The simple truth of her statement hit harder than I expected. Someone should be doing it. In a properly functioning family, someone would be. But in my family, the lines of support ran only one direction, toward my siblings, never back to me. "Has anyone called this morning?" Elena asked carefully, arranging the croissants on a plate. "No." I took a sip of the tea, letting the warm ginger soothe my throat. "To be fair, it's early." Elena's expression suggested she didn't think the hour was any excuse, but she simply nodded. "We should leave by 8. The oncology center likes patients to arrive 30 minutes before scheduled infusions to handle paperwork and preliminary blood work. The Portland Cancer Center occupied the 3rd floor of a modern medical building adjacent to the main hospital. The reception area was designed to feel welcoming: soft lighting, comfortable seating, artwork featuring Oregon's natural landscapes. But nothing could fully disguise the reality of why people came here. At the reception desk, a woman with a kind smile and a name tag reading Gloria checked me in efficiently. "First time with us, Ms. Parker?" "Yes," I confirmed, signing the various consent forms she pushed across the counter. "Dr. Patel will meet with you briefly before your infusion to review your treatment plan and answer any questions. Is this your first chemotherapy session ever?" I nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in my stomach. "Don't worry, honey. We'll take good care of you." She glanced at Elena. "Is this your daughter?" The assumption was understandable. At 35, Elena could have been my daughter, and the concern evident on her face certainly suggested a familial connection. "My assistant," I clarified, though the word felt inadequate given all she'd done in the past few weeks. "And friend," Elena added firmly. Gloria's eyes softened with something that might have been sympathy. "Well, you're lucky to have such a good friend with you. We encourage support people during treatment. Makes the time go faster." She handed me a plastic ID bracelet and directed us to the waiting area. As we settled into adjacent chairs, I found myself studying the other patients. Some were obviously deep into treatment, thin, pale, wearing scarves or hats to cover hair loss. Others, like me, still looked relatively healthy, their illnesses not yet visible to the casual observer. Almost all of them had someone with them, spouses holding hands, adult children checking phones, friends chatting quietly. Jennifer Parker? A nurse in blue scrubs appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Elena squeezed my arm gently as I stood. "I'll be right here." The preliminary procedures were straightforward. Blood draw to check my counts before treatment. Could begin. Weight measurement to calculate dosages. Blood pressure, temperature. A series of questions about symptoms and side effects, even though I hadn't started treatment yet. Dr. Patel, my oncologist, met me in a small consultation room. In his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he had a calm, measured way of speaking that I'd found reassuring during our initial consultation last week. "Your blood work looks good," he said, reviewing the results on his tablet. "White cell count is within normal range, which is what we want to see before starting treatment." He explained again how the chemotherapy would work, a combination of carboplatin and paclitaxel administered intravenously every 3 weeks for 6 cycles, barring complications. He reviewed the potential side effects: nausea, fatigue, hair loss, decreased blood counts, neuropathy in my hands and feet. "Everyone responds differently," he emphasized. "Some patients experience minimal side effects, others find them more challenging. We'll monitor you closely and adjust as needed." I nodded, trying to absorb all the information even as part of me remained detached, as if we were discussing someone else's treatment plan. "Do you have any questions before we begin?" he asked. A dozen questions crowded my mind, but only one made it to my lips. "What are my actual chances, realistically?" Dr. Patel set down his tablet and met my gaze directly. "With stage 3 ovarian cancer that's been surgically debulked as effectively as yours, followed by this chemotherapy regimen, 5-year survival rates are approximately 60 to 70%. But those are population statistics, not predictions for individual patients." It wasn't the reassurance I might have wanted, but I appreciated his honesty. "And quality of life during treatment?" "Most patients find the first week after each. Infusion the most challenging. Fatigue and nausea tend to be most pronounced then. The second and third weeks often bring improvement. Many people continue working, though usually with reduced hours or responsibilities." Working. Of course that was a concern. The firm couldn't run itself indefinitely without me, despite Elena's competence. My siblings couldn't manage their financial affairs without my oversight. The trust required regular attention. "I have excellent anti-nausea medications prepared," Dr. Patel continued, misinterpreting my silence as anxiety about side effects. "And our team is available 24/7 if you experience any concerning symptoms." "Thank you," I said, refocusing on the conversation. "I'm ready to begin." The treatment room was larger than I'd expected, with several recliners arranged to provide both accessibility for the medical staff and some privacy for patients. A television mounted in the corner played a home renovation show with the volume low. Large windows overlooked a landscaped courtyard, currently glistening with rain. The nurse assigned to me, Benita, guided me to a recliner by the window and helped me get comfortable. Elena joined us, setting up her laptop on a small side table. "I brought some work to do," she explained, "but I can put it away if you'd rather talk or watch something together." "Work is fine," I assured her, oddly comforted by the normalcy of her spreadsheets and emails amid the clinical setting. Benita explained each step as she prepared the infusion. First came pre-medications, anti-nausea drugs, steroids to prevent allergic reactions, and a mild sedative to help with anxiety. Then the chemotherapy drugs themselves, contained in bags that hung from an IV pole beside my chair. "The carboplatin will run for about an hour," she said, adjusting the drip rate. "Then we'll start the paclitaxel, which takes about 3 hours. Total treatment time is usually around 5 hours, including all the pre-meds." 5 hours. A significant chunk of life to spend watching poison drip into my veins, however necessary that poison might be. I settled back in the recliner, trying to find a comfortable position, and pulled out my tablet. I'd downloaded several books I'd been meaning to read for months, but never found time for. Perhaps cancer would finally give me the opportunity to catch up on my reading list. A morbidly ironic silver lining. The first hour passed uneventfully. The anti-nausea medications made me slightly drowsy, but not uncomfortably so. Elena worked quietly beside me, occasionally showing me emails that required my input but handling most matters independently. Benita checked on me regularly, monitoring my vital signs and asking about any unusual sensations. By the second hour, as the paclitaxel began, I felt a strange tingling in my hands and along my jaw, a common side effect, Benita assured me, and not cause for concern unless it became painful. I found myself unable to focus on my book, the words swimming slightly on the page. "Would you like to watch something instead?" Elena asked, noticing my distraction. "I brought your iPad with those British mystery shows you like." The thoughtfulness of her preparation brought a lump to my throat. "That would be nice, thank you." As the third hour began, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Sarah, what time should we come to the hospital tonight?" Not, "How are you feeling?" or "Is the treatment going okay?" Just logistics as always. "Visiting hours end at 8:00, I replied simply. "We'll be there by 7:30, she wrote back. "Do you need anything? Magazines? Snacks?" The belated offer almost made me smile. "No, thank you. Just seeing everyone will be enough." A polite fiction, but one that maintained the peace. The remainder of the treatment passed in a fog of mild discomfort and drowsiness. By the time Benita removed the IV and bandaged my port access site, I felt a profound fatigue unlike anything I'd experienced before, bone deep and insistent. "This is normal," she assured me, helping me sit up slowly. "The medications affect everyone differently, but fatigue is almost universal. Take it very easy for the next few days. Rest when your body tells you to rest." Elena gathered our belongings and offered her arm for support as we made our way to the elevator. In the REE parking garage, she insisted on bringing the car around rather than having me walk the short distance to where she'd parked. "The nurse said you might feel worse before you feel better," she explained as she helped me into the passenger seat. "The steroids they give you during treatment mask some of the immediate side effects, but they'll wear off by tonight." The Pari drive home through Portland's afternoon traffic was mercifully quick. Elena had timed our departure to avoid the worst congestion. As we pulled into my building's underground parking, she outlined the evening's plan. "I've prepared your guest room, so I'll stay tonight and tomorrow night at minimum. The anti-nausea medications are on a schedule for the first 48 hours. Very important to stay ahead of any symptoms rather than trying to manage them after they start. Dr. Patel called in a prescription for sleep aids if you need them. I've downloaded several guided meditations specifically for chemotherapy patients. And the refrigerator is stocked with easy, bland foods that should be gentle on your stomach." She'd thought of everything, anticipated every need. It was more consideration than anyone in my family had ever shown me, even in times of crisis. "Elena," I said as she helped me from the car, "thank you for all of this." She looked almost embarrassed. "It's what anyone would do." "No," I corrected gently. "It's what family should do, but often doesn't." By early evening, the steroids began wearing off as predicted, and the true impact of the chemotherapy drugs made itself known. Waves of nausea arrived despite the preventative medications. The fatigue intensified until even holding up my head required conscious effort. My skin felt hypersensitive, each touch magnified unpleasantly. Elena managed it all with quiet efficiency. She adjusted pillows, administered medications, kept the lights dim, and spoke in hushed tones. When a particularly severe wave of nausea hit around 6:30, she held a cool washcloth to my forehead and simply sat with me until it passed. "My siblings are coming at 7:30, I reminded her weakly as I lay back against the pillows, exhausted from the simple act of being sick. "Are you sure you're up for visitors?" Her concern was evident. "I can call and suggest they come tomorrow instead." "No," I insisted. "They need to see this, to understand." Understanding dawned in her eyes. This wasn't just about receiving family support. It was about making sure they witnessed the reality of what I was facing. No more hiding behind competence and capability. No more protecting them from uncomfortable truths. "I'll make sure they don't stay too long," she promised. At precisely 7:28, the doorbell rang. Elena went to answer it while I attempted to make myself marginally more presentable. I'd changed into comfortable pajamas, but there was little I could do about my pallor or the exhaustion evident in my eyes. Voices drifted from the entryway. All three of my siblings, along with Rebecca, apparently coming together directly from dinner, judging by the fragments of conversation about restaurant service. Elena's voice provided quiet counterpoint, presumably updating them on my condition and setting expectations for the visit. When they entered my bedroom, the shock on their faces was almost gratifying. They'd expected discomfort, perhaps, but not this. Not their capable older sister reduced to a pale, trembling figure propped against pillows. "Jen?" Sarah breathed, approaching the bed cautiously. "Oh my God." "First day of chemo," I explained, my voice raspier than I'd expected. Not my best look. Michael hovered uncertainly at the foot of the bed. "Should you be in the hospital? You look..." He trailed off, apparently unable to find a polite description. "Outpatient treatment is standard," Elena supplied from the doorway, "unless there are severe reactions." David, never comfortable with illness, had positioned himself near the window, physically as far from my sickbed as the room allowed. "The doctor said this would happen. This is normal." "Very normal," I confirmed. "This is what chemotherapy does. It kills cancer cells, but it's not particularly selective. Takes healthy cells too." Rebecca approached and carefully took my hand, the only one brave enough to initiate physical contact. "Is there anything we can do? Anything you need?" What I needed was for my family to finally see me, truly see me, not as a resource or a solution to their problems, but as a human, being with limitations and needs of my own. This visit, as brief and uncomfortable as it might be, was the beginning of that process. "Just being here helps," I said, the half-truth easier than explaining the complex recalibration of our relationship that was taking place. They stayed for 20 minutes, a period that clearly stretched their collective comfort with illness and vulnerability. The conversation remained stilted, punctuated by long silences and awkward attempts at normalcy. Sarah mentioned Amber's college orientation schedule. Michael made vague references to a new investment opportunity. David remained largely silent, his discomfort palpable. Only Rebecca made any genuine effort to connect, asking specific questions about my treatment plan and listening attentively to my abbreviated explanations. As they prepared to leave, she hung back slightly. "I meant what I said about calling anytime," she said quietly, "even if it's the middle of the night and you just need someone to talk to." I studied her face, searching for the calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing in my family members, finding instead only sincere concern. "Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate that." After they left, Elena returned with ginger tea and more anti-nausea medication. "That went about as expected," she observed neutrally. "Actually, it was revelatory," I replied, accepting the tea with slightly shaky hands. Did you notice none of them asked about tomorrow? About who would be staying with me or taking me to follow-up appointments or helping manage side effects? They saw how sick I am and still didn't think to offer practical support. Rebecca seemed genuinely concerned, Elena noted. Yes, I acknowledged. Ironically, the in-law showed more genuine empathy than my blood relatives. I took a careful sip of tea. I think this confirms we're on the right track with the changes to my will and the trust structure. The next morning brought marginally less nausea but even more profound fatigue. Every movement required deliberate effort, as if my limbs were weighted with invisible sandbags. Elena helped me to the living room sofa, where I could at least have a change of scenery from my bedroom walls. Thomas Whitfield called, she informed me, arranging pillows and a light blanket around me. He can come here this afternoon for your meeting if you're not up to going to his office. I nodded gratefully. The thought of dressing and traveling across town seemed insurmountable. Did he sound surprised? About your diagnosis? Yes, concerned too. He asked if there was anything he could do personally, not just professionally. That sounded like Thomas. Unlike my siblings, he had always seen me as more than just the executor of my father's estate or the manager of family funds. He'd been my father's friend first, becoming mine through years of shared work and mutual respect. What time is he coming? 2:00. I told him to plan for about an hour, given your energy levels. Elena placed my phone and tablet within easy reach. I've cleared your calendar completely for this week and next. Rescheduled the quarterly review meetings for after your recovery period. Assigned the Johnson portfolio analysis to Mark with your pre-approved parameters. She hesitated. There was one call I wasn't sure how to handle. Amber called this morning, asking if she could visit. That was unexpected. Amber? Did she say why? She seemed genuinely worried about you. Said she couldn't stop thinking about what you might be going through, especially after seeing how her parents reacted last night. Interesting. Of all my nieces and nephews, Amber had always seemed the most self-absorbed, focused on her social media presence and designer wardrobe. The idea that she might have shown more emotional intelligence than her parents was both surprising and somewhat hopeful. Tell her she can come tomorrow afternoon if she'd like. Short visit. The hours until Thomas's arrival passed in a haze of brief naps and half-hearted attempts to read. The severe nausea had subsided to a persistent queasiness that made eating unappealing but no longer impossible. Elena coaxed me into consuming small portions of bland food, plain toast, a poached egg, half a banana, interspersed with sips of ginger tea and electrolyte drinks. At precisely 2:00, the doorbell rang. Thomas Whitfield had been punctual since the day I met him, 25 years ago in my father's office. Elena showed him in, and I could see the momentary shock in his eyes, quickly masked by professional composure. Jennifer, he said warmly, taking the chair Elena had positioned near the sofa. I must say, when you mentioned health news, I didn't anticipate something quite so serious. Neither did I admitted. But here we are. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed a legal pad. You mentioned wanting to make changes to your will and the trust structure. I've taken the liberty of reviewing your current documents in preparation. He glanced at Elena, who had seated herself discreetly at the dining table with her laptop. Would you prefer we speak privately? Elena stays, I said firmly. In fact, she's central to the changes I'm planning to make. If this surprised him, Thomas didn't show it. He simply nodded and uncapped his pen. Very well. What did you have in mind? For the next 45 minutes, I outlined the changes I wanted to implement. My personal estate, separate from the family trust and valued at approximately $47 million, would be restructured completely. Previously, it had been divided equally among my siblings and their children. Now, the bulk would go to a foundation supporting cancer research and patient advocacy, with significant provisions for Elena and several key employees at the firm. The foundation will be named for my mother, I explained, referring to the Parker Reynolds Cancer Research and Patient Support Foundation I'd been conceptualizing. 50% of my estate will fund its initial endowment. 20% will go to Elena in recognition of her loyalty and friendship. 10% to be divided among specific employees at the firm. The remaining 20% to be distributed among those nieces and nephews who demonstrate genuine care and support during my illness and recovery. Thomas's pen moved steadily across his legal pad as I spoke. And the criteria for determining which nieces and nephews qualify? I'll document specific actions and behaviors, visits during treatment, practical assistance, genuine emotional support versus obligatory check-ins. I want to reward authentic care, not performative concern. He nodded, making additional notes. And the family trust? You mentioned changes there as well. This was the more complex aspect of my plan. As trustee, I had significant discretion over distributions and management, but there were limitations to what I could unilaterally change, without broader family consent. First, I want to temporarily transfer trustee duties to you during my treatment and initial recovery. This will remove my siblings' ability to pressure me for additional funds when I'm most vulnerable. Thomas nodded. Easily arranged. Your father's trust documents include specific provisions for temporary incapacity of the primary trustee. Second, I want to modify the distribution structure. Currently, my siblings receive quarterly payments with additional amounts available at trustee discretion. I want to eliminate the discretionary component entirely. They receive their scheduled distributions, nothing more. This would be a significant change. Over the years, the discretionary component had grown to nearly match the scheduled distributions, as my siblings found increasingly creative justifications for additional funds. That's within your authority as trustee, Thomas confirmed, though it will certainly generate resistance. Finally, and most importantly, I want to change the succession plan for both the trust and the firm. Here was the true bombshell. Currently, upon my death or permanent incapacity, control of both the family trust and the financial consulting firm would pass to Michael as the eldest male child, an outdated provision my father had never revised before his death. Instead of passing to Michael, I want operational control of the firm to transfer to a board of directors, with Elena as chief operating officer and voting member of the board. The trust should be administered by you or your successor at the firm, with strict adherence to the distribution schedule and no discretionary payments without unanimous board approval. Thomas sat back, his expression thoughtful. Some of these changes will require careful legal navigation, particularly the succession plans. Your father's original documents included specific provisions that we'll need to address, but none of it is impossible. He glanced at Elena, who had been silently working at the dining table. I assume Ms. Martinez is aware of these plans? We've discussed them, I confirmed. She's agreed to accept the responsibilities, should they become necessary. Which they won't, Elena interjected firmly. Because you're going to recover fully. Thomas smiled slightly at her determination. Of course, but proper planning is always prudent. He made a few final notes before closing his legal pad. I'll have preliminary documents drafted for your review by next week. In the meantime, I'll prepare the temporary trusteeship transfer effective immediately. As he packed his briefcase, he paused, his professional demeanor softening. Jennifer, I've known your family for over 30 years. I was present when your father signed his original will, when he established the trust, when he proudly watched. You graduate law school before joining the firm. I believe he would approve of these changes. He always said you were the only one who truly understood the value of what he'd built. The unexpected endorsement brought tears to my eyes. Thank you, Thomas. That means a great deal. After he left, Elena brought me a cup of tea and sat on the edge of the sofa. That went well. It did, I agreed, suddenly exhausted by the effort of focusing for so long. Though the real test will come when my siblings discover the changes. Which won't happen until necessary, she reminded me. The temporary trusteeship is the only immediate change. Everything else is contingency planning. I nodded, leaning back against the pillows. Necessary contingency planning. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, I found myself reflecting on the past 2 days, the stark reality of chemotherapy, my siblings' uncomfortable hospital visit, Thomas's quiet support, and the restructuring of my legacy that was now underway. The cancer had forced me to confront not just my mortality, but the true nature of my relationships, which ones nourished me and which had become one-sided obligations. Regardless of my prognosis, whether I survived this cancer or not, I had taken the first steps toward reclaiming agency in my own life. I had recognized my own worth and demanded that others do the same. I had established boundaries that should have been in place years ago, and I had ensured that my life's work would continue to reflect my values, with or without my physical presence to enforce them. The next morning brought a tentative knock on my apartment door around 11. Elena answered it, and I heard Amber's uncertain voice asking if I was awake. I'd almost forgotten that I'd agreed to her visit, exhaustion having blurred the previous day's conversations. "She's in the living room," Elena said. "She's having a better day than yesterday, but still very tired. Keep it short, okay?" I adjusted my position on the sofa, pulling the light blanket over my legs and attempting to look less fragile than I felt. Amber appeared in the doorway, clutching a small gift bag and looking uncharacteristically hesitant. At 18, my niece was usually the picture of confident youth. Beautiful, popular, accustomed to commanding attention in any room she entered. Today, she seemed almost childlike in her uncertainty. "Aunt Jen?" She hovered at the edge of the room. "Is it okay that I came? Mom said I should wait until next week, but I wanted to see you." "It's fine, Amber. Come sit." I patted the chair Elena had positioned near the sofa. "Just keep your expectations low for sparkling conversation. The medications make me a bit foggy." She approached cautiously, as if I might shatter with too much proximity. "I brought you something." She held out the gift bag. "It's not much, just I thought it might help." Inside the bag was a soft, lightweight cashmere beanie in a deep teal color, my favorite, and a beautifully bound journal with handmade paper. "The hat is for when?" She gestured vaguely toward my head, clearly uncomfortable with mentioning hair loss directly. "And the journal. My psychology teacher said writing can be therapeutic during major life challenges. I thought maybe you could use it to record your thoughts, or treatment notes, or whatever." The thoughtfulness of the gifts took me by surprise. This was not the self-absorbed Amber I was accustomed to, the girl who had texted me 3 times, in one day last month demanding additional funds for her graduation party because the initial budget I'd provided was totally inadequate for anyone who matters. "Thank you, Amber. These are perfect." I touched the soft wool of the beanie. "How did you know teal was my favorite color?" She looked down, suddenly shy. "I pay attention sometimes, even if it doesn't seem like it." For a moment, we sat, in silence. Then Amber took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Mom and Dad were weird after visiting you yesterday. They kept talking about practical stuff. Who would handle the trust while you're sick? Whether the firm would be affected? If your treatment costs would impact the quarterly distributions?" She twisted a silver ring on her finger. And I just kept thinking, that's not the point, is it? The point is that you're going through something really scary, and none of us asked how you felt about it. We just keep taking and taking from you, and the one time you need something from us, we're basically useless. Her candid assessment was so unexpected and so accurate that for a moment I couldn't respond. This level of self-awareness from any of my relatives, let alone from Amber, was unprecedented. That's a very mature perspective, I managed finally. She shrugged, still fidgeting with her ring. I had this English assignment last semester about empathy, putting yourself in someone else's position. We had to write from the perspective of a character who's totally different from us. I wrote about an older woman watching her family drift away. It was just an assignment, but... She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I think maybe I was writing about you without realizing it. About how lonely it must be to always be the one giving and never receiving. The insight struck deep, uncomfortably accurate. Had I been so transparent in my loneliness? Or was Amber simply more perceptive than I'd given her credit for? Family dynamics are complicated, I said carefully. Your mom and her brothers grew up with certain expectations about my role in their lives. Patterns established decades ago are hard to break. But that doesn't make them right, Amber insisted. And it doesn't mean they can't change. She hesitated. I know I've been part of the problem too. Always asking for money, never really thanking you properly for everything you've done. The college fund, the graduation party, all of it. This conversation was veering into territory I hadn't anticipated. After yesterday's meeting with Thomas, I'd been mentally preparing for resistance and resentment from my family when the changes to the will and trust eventually came to light. I hadn't expected anything resembling insight or remorse, especially not from the youngest generation. We all have opportunities to grow and change, I said, choosing my words carefully. What matters is recognizing those opportunities when they present themselves. Amber nodded earnestly. That's why I'm here. I want to help, really help, not just show up for appearances. Mom said your treatments will be every 3 weeks. I want to go with you next time. Elena can't be the only one helping. That's not fair. The offer was so genuine, so unexpected that I felt a lump form in my throat. I'd like that, Amber. Thank you. And maybe, she hesitated, maybe you could teach me some stuff about the family business? I'm studying business administration, but Mom and Dad never talk about the actual work you do, just the money it provides. I'd like to understand it better. This, too, was unprecedented. None of my nieces or nephews had ever expressed interest in understanding the family business, only in the lifestyle it funded. Even Michael, who had always assumed he would eventually take over, had never bothered to learn the details of our investment strategies or client relationships. I'd be happy to, I said, meaning it despite my fatigue. We could start with some basic concepts next week, if I'm feeling up to it. Amber smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in ages. That would be amazing. We talked for another 20 minutes, about her upcoming orientation at Stanford, about her friends who were scattering to different colleges, about her tentative interest in finance as a potential career path. Throughout the conversation, she remained attentive to my energy levels, offering to leave when she noticed me growing tired. As Elena showed her out, I heard Amber ask quietly, "Is there a schedule or something? For who stays with her and when? I want to sign up for some shifts." Elena's response was too low for me to hear, but when she returned to the living room, her expression was thoughtful. "That was unexpected," she commented, adjusting my pillows. "Very," I agreed. "Do you think it was genuine?" It seemed so. Elena sat on the edge of the sofa. People can surprise you, especially when they're young and still forming their adult selves. She paused. "Does this change anything? About your plans for the will?" I considered the question carefully. Not the structure, but perhaps the implementation. I've always intended the revisions to reward those who show authentic care, not to punish those who don't. Amber just positioned herself in the former category, if her actions match her words. "And your siblings?" "Remain firmly in the latter until proven otherwise." The rest of the week fell into a pattern dictated by my body's response to the chemotherapy. Days 2 and 3 brought the worst of the side effects: debilitating fatigue, persistent nausea, and a foggy mental state that made even reading or watching television require more concentration than I could muster. By day 4, the acute symptoms began to recede, replaced by a generalized weakness and lingering metallic taste that made eating a chore rather than a pleasure. Elena stayed with me through it all, working remotely from my dining table when I was sleeping, sitting quietly with me when I was awake but too exhausted for conversation. She fielded calls and messages from my siblings, who checked in sporadically with brief texts inquiring about my condition but offering no practical assistance. On Friday afternoon, as I was finally feeling human enough to move from the bedroom to the living room without assistance, Thomas Whitfield called. "The temporary trusteeship papers are ready for your signature," he informed me. "I can bring them by this afternoon if you're feeling up to it." "That would be fine," I assured him, finding myself actually looking forward to the visit. Thomas represented a connection to my father, to the values he'd instilled in me that my siblings had apparently missed or forgotten. When he arrived in Chasiori an hour later, Thomas looked around my apartment with appreciation. "You've created a lovely home, Jennifer. Your father would have approved of the view. He always said a good view was worth the investment." The simple observation brought an unexpected "ang." My father had indeed loved views, particularly of water or mountains. When I purchased this apartment 5 years ago, the expansive windows overlooking the river had been a primary selling point, reminding me of the summer home my parents had maintained during our childhood. "He would have," I agreed, accepting the folder Thomas handed me. "Are these the temporary trusteeship documents?" He nodded, taking the seat I indicated. "Straightforward legal language authorizing me to assume trustee duties during your medical treatment. Completely reversible, once you feel ready to resume the role." He paused. "I've also included preliminary drafts of the will revisions we discussed, for your review when you're feeling stronger." I scanned the trusteeship documents, my legal training allowing me to quickly identify the key provisions. Everything appeared in order, a clean transfer of administrative authority while preserving my ultimate control over major decisions. I signed where indicated, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. "I've prepared a memo for your siblings, explaining the temporary arrangement," Thomas said, accepting the signed documents. "Purely factual. No mention of your diagnosis unless you wish to disclose it." "They already know," I told him, though their response has been illuminating. Thomas's expression suggested he wasn't surprised. "Alexander always worried about how they would manage without him. He believed you were the only one who truly understood the responsibility that comes with wealth." Alexander. My father's name, so rarely spoken aloud these days. The man who had built a modest family investment practice into a regionally significant firm through intelligence, integrity, and genuine care for his clients' well-being. The man who had tried, unsuccessfully it seemed, to instill those same values in all his children. "He would be disappointed in how they've handled this situation," I said quietly. "Perhaps," Thomas allowed, "but he would be immensely proud of you. Not just for your management of the firm and the trust, but for the strength you're showing now." The validation from someone who had known my father so well meant more than I could express. "Thank you, Thomas." After he left, I sat with the preliminary drafts of my revised will, reading through the legal language that would reshape my legacy. The foundation I'd conceptualized was taking formal shape on the pages before me. Its mission, governance structure, and funding mechanisms all clearly defined. The provisions for Elena and key employees were outlined with appropriate detail. The criteria for determining which nieces and nephews would share in the remaining portion were thoughtfully constructed, focusing on actions rather than intentions or verbal expressions of concern. It was all there, exactly as I'd envisioned. Yet Amber's visit had introduced a new variable. If her apparent insight and remorse were genuine, If her offer of practical support materialized into actual assistance, she would be the first family member to qualify for a share under the new structure. More importantly, she represented the possibility that my family wasn't entirely beyond redemption, that there might be hope for meaningful change, at least in the younger generation. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting. To think that my legacy might include positive influence on at least one family member. Unsettling to realize how completely I'd written off the possibility of authentic connection with any of them. As week 1 of treatment transitioned into week 2, my physical condition improved steadily. The debilitating fatigue receded to manageable tiredness. The nausea subsided enough for me to enjoy simple foods again. My mental fog lifted, allowing me to review work documents for short periods and even participate in a video conference with key clients who had been concerned about my absence. Elena had begun returning to her own apartment at night, though she still spent most days with me, balancing her work responsibilities with ensuring I had everything I needed. Lucas had stopped by twice, bringing books he thought I might enjoy, and simply sitting with me, his quiet presence a welcome change from his mother's nervous energy when she visited briefly on Sunday. Amber, true to her word, had texted daily and visited twice more, each time bringing thoughtful small gifts, a luxurious hand cream when I mentioned the chemotherapy was drying my skin, an assortment of herbal teas recommended by her friend's mother who had gone through similar treatment last year. She had also begun asking genuine questions about the family business, showing surprising aptitude for financial concepts when I explained some basic investment strategies. The most unexpected development, however, came from Rebecca. My sister-in-law, always somewhat peripheral in family gatherings, had emerged as a consistent source of support. She called every other day, not with forced cheer or awkward questions about my health, but with simple conversation about books she was reading, films she thought I might enjoy when I felt stronger, occasional humorous observations about Michael's cluelessness regarding household management. "He tried to make pasta yesterday," she shared during one call, her voice warm with affectionate exasperation. "Somehow didn't realize you need to drain the water before adding sauce. It was essentially tomato soup with overcooked spaghetti floating in it." These glimpses into normal life, shared without expectation or demand, became bright spots in days that were otherwise defined by physical recovery and the practical realities of illness. Rebecca never stayed too long or pushed too hard, seeming to intuitively understand the energy limitations imposed by my treatment. By contrast, my siblings maintained their distance, checking in with perfunctory texts and brief visits that always somehow circled back to questions about the trust administration or the firm's operations. Sarah expressed thinly veiled impatience. When informed that her request for additional funds for Tyler's apartment would need to go through Thomas, David complained about the inconvenience of having to provide detailed justification for expenses he'd previously simply charged to the trust. Michael hovered anxiously during his one visit, clearly uncomfortable with the physical manifestations of my illness and eager to discuss when I might return to work. "The Johnson account is asking questions about the leadership transition," he mentioned, pacing near my windows. "I told them it's temporary, of course, but they seem concerned about continuity. Elena has been briefed on all major client relationships," I assured him, watching as his expression tightened at the mention of my assistant's expanded role. "She's more than capable of maintaining those connections during my treatment." "Yes, but she's not family," he objected. "The clients expect a Parker to be overseeing their investments. I was thinking I could step in more formally, just as a figurehead to reassure them." And there it was, the real reason for his visit. Not concern for my health, but an opportunity to position himself for greater control of the firm. Control he had done nothing to earn through knowledge or commitment to our father's business principles. "The leadership transition has been clearly communicated to all clients," I said firmly. "Elena has my complete confidence, and the executive team is fully functional without daily involvement from either of us. But thank you for your concern." His disappointment was barely concealed as he made excuses to cut his visit short, citing a dinner engagement he'd nearly forgotten. After he left, I sat looking out at the river, understanding with perfect clarity that nothing had changed in our fundamental dynamic. Even my cancer was viewed primarily through the lens of how it affected his interests, his comfort, his potential advancement. The following Tuesday marked the halfway point between my first chemotherapy session and my second, scheduled for next Monday. Dr. Patel had arranged a brief checkup to assess my recovery and address any concerns before the next treatment. "Your blood counts are holding steady," he noted, reviewing the results of tests taken earlier that morning. "White cells are on the lower end of normal, which is expected, but not dangerously so. How's your energy level?" "Improving daily," I reported. "Still nowhere near pre-treatment levels, but I can function for longer periods before needing to rest." "And the nausea?" "Manageable with the medications. The metallic taste remains problematic." He nodded, making notes in my chart. "Very common. Some patients find that using plastic utensils rather than metal ones helps a bit. Also, cold foods tend to have less metallic aftertaste than hot ones." We discussed other side effects: mild tingling in my fingertips, occasional headaches, the beginning of hair thinning that hadn't yet progressed to noticeable loss. Throughout the conversation, Elena sat quietly beside me, taking notes on the doctor's recommendations and asking occasional clarifying questions. "Overall, you're tolerating the treatment well," Dr. Patel concluded. "Better than many patients at this stage. I see no reason to modify our approach for the second cycle." As we prepared to leave, he paused, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Parker, I noticed that your support person has been consistent throughout your visits and appointments." He glanced at Elena. "That consistency is valuable during treatment. Patients with stable support systems typically manage side effects better and report higher quality of life throughout the process." The gentle observation carried a clear subtext. He had noticed the absence of family members at my appointments. Whether through experience or intuition, he seemed to understand that my support structure was not what might be expected for someone of my age and family situation. "I'm fortunate to have excellent support," I said simply, with a grateful glance at Elena. In the car heading home, Elena was unusually quiet. Finally, as we stopped at a traffic light, she spoke. "Jennifer, I need to discuss something with you." The formal tone was uncharacteristic, and I turned to look at her with concern. "What is it?" "It's about the changes to your will." She kept her eyes on the road as the light changed. "Specifically, the provision leaving 20% of your estate to me." This was unexpected. "Is there a problem?" "I'm uncomfortable with it," she said frankly. "Not because I don't appreciate the gesture, I do deeply, but it could be interpreted as inappropriate. I'm your employee. A substantial bequest could be seen as undue influence, especially given my role in your care during illness." The concern was valid from a legal perspective, though it hadn't occurred to me given our relationship, which had long ago transcended the boundaries of a typical employer-employee dynamic. "I understand your concern," I said carefully, "but the bequest isn't for your role as my assistant or even as my caregiver. It's in recognition of the friendship and support you've provided for years, long before this diagnosis. Thomas has structured it appropriately to avoid any appearance of impropriety," she sighed, pulling into the parking garage beneath my building. "I know, and I'm not refusing. I just want to be certain you've considered how it might look to your family." "My family," I said quietly, "has forfeited any right to judge how I distribute my personal assets. They've made their priorities abundantly clear during this crisis. I'm simply ensuring that my estate reflects the reality of who has truly been family to me, regardless of blood connection." Elena parked and turned to look at me directly. "That's what worries me. I don't want to be the cause of further family discord if, when you recover, Her slip was telling. For all her outward optimism about my prognosis, Elena was practical enough to recognize the uncertainties ahead. Stage 3. Ovarian cancer, even with optimal treatment, carried significant risks. We both knew the statistics, though we rarely discussed them directly. I'm not making these decisions from a place of anger or retaliation, I assured her. I'm making them from a place of clarity. This diagnosis has stripped away pretense and revealed the true nature of my relationships. I'm simply responding to that reality. She nodded slowly. I understand. But promise me you'll review these decisions again when you're further along in treatment. When the initial shock and adjustment period has passed. If you still feel the same way then, I'll accept your decision without further question. It was a reasonable request, and one that aligned with my own sense of fairness. Major decisions made during times of crisis should be subject to review when clearer heads prevail. I promise, I agreed. After the third treatment cycle, we'll discuss it again. If my perspective has changed by then, we can make adjustments. The compromise seemed to satisfy her, and we headed upstairs to my apartment in more comfortable silence. As we entered, my phone buzzed with a text message. Amber, can I come by tomorrow after my dentist appointment? Around 2 ya? I have questions. About diversified investment portfolios for my summer reading assignment. I smiled slightly at the transparent excuse. Amber's summer reading almost certainly didn't include investment strategy, but her effort to connect through the business, rather than through my illness, was touching in its awkwardness. Amber's coming tomorrow, I told Elena as I texted back a simple affirmative. Apparently to discuss diversified investment portfolios. Elena raised an eyebrow. That's specific for an 18-year-old's casual interest. She's trying, I said, feeling an unexpected surge of protective affection for my niece. She doesn't know how to relate to me in this new context, so she's creating a framework that feels safe. Unlike her parents, who aren't trying at all, Elena observed dryly. Unlike her parents, I agreed, who haven't yet realized that their comfortable world is about to change fundamentally, regardless of my medical outcome. The following afternoon, Amber arrived precisely at 2, carrying a notebook and what appeared to be a printout of an introductory investment text. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the elaborate styles she typically favored, and she wore minimal makeup, subtle changes that somehow emphasized her youth and vulnerability. I hope it's okay that I came, she said as Elena showed her in. Mom said you might be too tired for visitors, but I promised to keep it short. It's fine, I assured her, noting with interest that Sarah had apparently discouraged the visit. I'm having a good day, and I always have. Time to discuss investment portfolios. I kept my tone light, acknowledging the transparent pretense without challenging it directly. Amber settled in the chair near the sofa, her notebook open to a page filled with neatly written questions. So, I was reading about asset allocation, and I don't really understand why someone would choose bonds when stocks have higher returns over time. The question was surprisingly thoughtful, suggesting she had actually done some research rather than simply using business topics as an excuse to visit. That's an excellent question, I said, genuinely impressed. The simplest answer is risk management. Bonds generally offer more stable, predictable returns than stocks, which can be volatile. In a diversified portfolio, they serve as a counterbalance to potential stock market fluctuations. For the next 45 minutes, we engaged in a conversation about basic investment principles that gradually evolved into a more personal discussion of values and priorities in financial decision-making. Amber listened attentively, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and took occasional notes. Her intelligence and genuine interest reminded me sharply of myself at a similar age, sitting in my father's study as he explained the family business to me while my siblings played outside, uninterested in concepts they assumed would never directly concern them. So, the firm doesn't just try to maximize profits? Amber asked at one point. It actually considers these other factors too? Your grandfather believed that true wealth management wasn't just about accumulating money, I explained. It was about aligning financial decisions with clients' broader life goals and values. Some clients prioritize security over growth potential. Others have specific ethical considerations about where their money is invested. Our job is to understand those priorities and build strategies that respect them. Amber considered this, twisting a strand of hair around her finger in a gesture that reminded me of her mother at the same age. That's not how Mom and Dad talk about money. They just focus on having enough for whatever they want to do or buy. The observation was astute and tinged with the beginnings of critical awareness. Different generations often have different perspectives on wealth, I said diplomatically. Your grandfather grew up with very little. Building the firm meant providing security for his family, but also creating something of lasting value beyond himself. That perspective shaped how I approach both the business and my personal financial decisions. Is that why you've been so generous with all of us? She asked directly. Because you see money as a tool for something bigger, not just for buying stuff? The question cut to the heart of my financial philosophy in a way none of my siblings had ever bothered to explore. Essentially, yes. Money itself has never been the goal for me. It's what it enables. Education, opportunity, security, the ability to help others. That's the legacy your grandfather wanted to create. Amber's expression grew thoughtful. But we've kind of missed the point, haven't we? Taking the money without understanding what it was supposed to mean. Her insight was so unexpected, so perfectly aligned with my own recent realizations, that for a moment I couldn't respond. This teenager, whom I'd largely dismissed as shallow and materialistic, had just articulated the core problem in our family's relationship with wealth more clearly than any of the adults had managed to do in years of discussions. That's a very perceptive observation, I said finally. And yes, I think there's been a disconnect between the resources provided and the values they were intended to support. She nodded slowly. I want to understand it better. Not just how to make money, but how to use it right. The way great-grandpa and you meant for it to be used. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt a surge of hope that perhaps my father's legacy might find true continuity after all. Not through my siblings, who had never grasped its essence, but through this unexpected connection with the next generation. I'd be happy to teach you, I said, meaning it deeply. Starting with the most important principle, wealth brings responsibility, not just privilege. Amber stayed for another half hour, our conversation moving from investment concepts to broader life questions. She shared her uncertainties about college, her growing awareness that her high school friendships had been largely superficial, her tentative interest in eventually working for the family firm rather than pursuing the fashion industry career she'd previously declared as her goal. Throughout the conversation, I found myself increasingly impressed by her capacity for reflection and growth. She was still young, still finding her way, but the potential for genuine depth and character was clearly there, waiting to be nurtured and developed. As she prepared to leave, Amber hesitated at the door. Aunt Jen, can I come with you to your next treatment? Mom and Dad don't know I'm asking, but I want to help. Really help. Not just visit after when it's convenient. The offer touched me deeply. I'd like that, Amber. It's on Monday at 8:30 in the morning. Elena can pick you up. I'll be ready, she promised. And I'll bring the next set of questions about investment strategies. We can talk during the treatment if you feel up to it. After she left, I sat reflecting on our conversation. A tentative hope blossoming that perhaps my legacy might include more than just financial provisions and legal structures. If Amber's apparent transformation proved genuine and lasting, my influence might extend to shaping the values and character of at least one member of the next generation, a different kind of immortality than the one my siblings seemed to expect from the family name. Elena returned from the errand she'd run during Amber's visit, carrying groceries and fresh flowers for the dining table. How was the investment tutorial? she asked, arranging sunny daffodils in a crystal vase. Surprisingly substantive, I admitted. She's actually been doing some reading on her own. Real questions, real interest. People can surprise you, Elena said, echoing her earlier observation, especially when they're given the opportunity to rise above expectations. She wants to come to Monday's treatment, I told her. She asked specifically, without prompting. Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. That's unexpected. But welcome, I added. Very welcome. The possibility that something positive might emerge from this difficult chapter, that my illness might catalyze genuine growth and connection within my family, even if only with one member, felt like a gift I hadn't anticipated when I first received my diagnosis. It didn't change my plans for restructuring my estate or the trust management, but it added a dimension of hope that had been notably absent in my calculations. As I prepared for my second chemotherapy session, I found myself contemplating this unexpected development. The journey ahead remained challenging and uncertain. The physical toll of treatment would likely increase with cumulative sessions. Relationships with my siblings showed little sign of meaningful evolution beyond superficial concern and continuing self-interest. But in Amber's genuine efforts to understand and connect, in Rebecca's quiet, consistent support, even in Lucas's thoughtful visits, I saw glimmers of possibility, the potential for authentic family bonds based on mutual care rather than financial dependency. These relationships, fragile as they might be, offered something my wealth alone never could: the knowledge that I was valued as a person, not merely as a resource. Perhaps that ultimately was the true measure of wealth, not the millions in my investment accounts or the valuable firm I'd helped build, but the genuine human connections that remained when all the external trappings were stripped away by crisis. By that measure, I was discovering myself to be both poorer and richer than I'd previously understood. Poorer in the number of authentic relationships than a lifetime of generosity should have cultivated. Richer in the depth and quality of the few that had proven themselves in this crucible of illness. As I packed my bag for Monday's treatment, comfortable. Clothes, the journal Amber had given me, headphones for the meditation tracks Elena had downloaded, I found myself experiencing an emotion I hadn't expected to feel in the midst of cancer treatment: gratitude. Not for the illness itself, certainly, but for the clarity it had brought, the pretenses it had stripped away, and the authentic connections it had revealed or inspired. Whatever the outcome of my medical journey, this personal revelation felt like a different kind of healing, one that addressed a loneliness I had carried far longer than any cancer cells. 6 months later, I sat in Dr. Patel's office, my fingers tracing the soft edge of my new scarf, a gift from Rebecca to celebrate my final treatment 3 weeks ago. The port had been removed yesterday, leaving only a small mark where it had once provided the gateway for the medications that had saved my life. "Your scans are clear," Dr. Patel announced, his normally reserved expression warming with genuine pleasure. "No evidence of disease. Of course, we'll continue monitoring closely for the next few years, but this is the outcome we hoped for." Elena, sitting beside me as she had for every appointment since that first devastating diagnosis, squeezed my hand. Amber, who had arranged her college schedule to be present for this crucial appointment, let out a small, joyful sound. "So, she's cancer-free?" Amber asked, leaning forward intently. "We prefer to say no evidence of disease," Dr. Patel explained gently. "But yes, the treatment has been successful." Outside the hospital, standing in the winter sunshine that seemed especially brilliant against the backdrop of last night's snow, I found myself experiencing a moment of perfect clarity. The journey had transformed me in ways no one could have predicted, not just physically, with my newly growing hair and slowly returning strength, but fundamentally in how I understood family, legacy, and love. "We should celebrate," Amber declared, linking her arm through mine. "A small dinner?" Just the people who really matter? Her emphasis on really spoke volumes. Throughout my treatment, the lines had been drawn with undeniable clarity. My siblings had maintained their distance, calling occasionally, but always steering conversations toward trust distributions or firm operations. Meanwhile, Amber had attended every treatment. Rebecca had coordinated a meal delivery rotation among her friends. Lucas had spent weekends helping with household tasks, and Elena had remained my constant, unwavering support. That sounds perfect, I agreed. Later that evening, in my apartment with its river views now sparkling with the lights of boats and bridges, I raised a glass of sparkling cider, alcohol still being inadvisable, and looked at the small gathering around my table. Not one of my siblings had been invited. Not one was missed. To new beginnings, I toasted, and to the family we choose. As glasses clinked, Thomas Whitfield, who had become an unexpected friend throughout this journey, nodded approvingly. The revised will had been finalized months ago. The trust restructuring was complete. The family firm had new leadership guidelines that would ensure its values survived regardless of who sat at its helm. My cancer had taken much from me: time, energy, certain illusions about family bonds. But it had given unexpected gifts as, well, clarity about what truly matters, courage to establish boundaries, and the freedom to redefine family based on love rather than obligation. Sometimes the hardest diagnoses reveal the deepest truths. And sometimes, when blood family fails to show up, the universe sends replacements who love more completely, care more genuinely, and honor more faithfully the person you truly are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.